Good morning, everyone. The weather has been terrible. The forecast is unbelievable, but it really isn't all that bad out there. So we appreciate very much you folks coming. And even more important, the Congressman Chris Gibson and his wife, Mary Jo, coming all the way down from Hudson. He's was a colonel in the Army, and I'm a farmer, and we talk to each other, and we're not going to let a little bit of snow stop us. So it was a mutual decision to have it. The number of people that have called me today saying that is it on or is it not on? Unbelievable. And we did the best we could, but we decided it was good to go. So thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to make two or three very brief comments. Number one, standing next to me, Chris Gibson, the best congressman we ever had in this area. One of the best in the history of the country. Second of all, his book, which I have a copy of, is amazing because it's the spirit of Philadelphia. And if there's ever a time the United States of America needs us to sit down and think a little bit about our roots, and I might change it to the spirit of working together, the spirit of our basic founding fathers' basic freedoms that they felt were so important for this country to do well. So that's different than what Chris says per se, but he's right on. One of the smartest people I ever met. You know what I like about the guy was the fact he has a PhD. He's an intellectual, president of a college, congressman, etc. I feel right at home with him. He could come up to the farm and help us deliver calves, okay? He's one of us, and that's why he was such a great congressman. He didn't forget from where he came, and I'm really anxious to hear him speak a little bit about the spirit of Philadelphia. Congressman,
Hey,
welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Hey, Dick and Penny, thank you so much, and to the folks on the board as well. It's a great privilege to be with you. I'm excited to be back. My wife, Mary Jo. Yeah, hopefully everybody sees me in there. Thank you. We've got folks, over a couple dozen on Zoom as well. So I want to thank those that came out in person, especially given the challenging weather, although I know I've got hardy folks here. In fact, one of the things I really enjoy is I still keep up wherever I can with the local media, and I read about how things are going for you. And I've loved some of the recent stories. In this case, I know I got Vincent from the Democrat, and it's awesome as well. But the Townsman actually had a piece that was reaching back over history. You may have seen what I'm talking about, and it was talking about snowstorms that hit the area, and people were writing in behind it, and saying we're talking like 2 to 3 dozen, 2 to 3 feet of snow. And then they showed some of the images, the great snowstorm, I think it was like 1912 or something like that. So I know I got hardy people, and I really appreciate that. I grew up in upstate New York myself, obviously Columbia County. But, Dick, to your point on the farms, one of the things I did when I got home from the Army is realizing how important it would be to represent farmers and the rural and the agricultural economy. I went to dairy boot camp. So how I did that is Eric Coombs, who is involved in the New York State Farm Bureau. He has a farm in Columbia County, and so I went out and I actually did work hand responsibility. So I was up really early, like 3 a.m, and I said, even the Army doesn't get up at 3. We were milking cows, I think, by 4:15, and there's 2 milks a day, and of course all the duty that happens with natural beings of this creation, and getting to get involved in that. So, anyways, it was certainly an important education for me, and it made me realize by the end of that day how exhausted I was. And I was like, "You guys are going to do this again tomorrow?" And they said, "We do it 365 days a year," and so I just appreciate what drives the rural economy. Not widely known is the Farm Bill, so-called, down in Washington, D.C. When I would talk to my colleagues, many of them who weren't from rural areas would think the Farm Bill is just about farms. And I said, really, the Farm Bill is really about rural development writ large. It's absolutely about farms, but it's also about folks who eat, consume from the farms. It's also about how we do infrastructure, broadly defined. Not only roads and bridges, but also electrification, came with this, and and of course, internet and everything like that. But what it really is a sense of empathy for a certain way to live your life, which you guys know so well. And so it was a great privilege to serve on the Agricultural Committee down in Washington and to do everything I could to support. So it's a bit nostalgic for my wife and I to be here today because we have so many great memories of this whole region, not only in Grahamsville, but up the hill and go to the pancake breakfasts. I did see, my wife and I saw Charlie Briner recently. We stopped in, he's at the VA, you may know, over in Dutchess County. But Charlie, of course, is, he's still trucking on in his mid-70s. Life's a little challenging for him now, but his spirits, you never know. I mean, it's just so positive all the time, but he's always so grateful for having grown up and lived here, his life in Claryville. So here to talk about, you think about what I've been, for the last 3 years, I've been on this project that really in many ways responds to some of the deeper research that we see in our country. So here I'm not just talking about like polling, day-to-day polling. There is a research institute called Pew, and Pew has been doing research about attitudes, perspectives about the American people in relation to our institutions, in relation to our leaders, in relation to our outlook on the future. And they've been doing it since the Second World War. And right now we have the lowest readings we've ever seen when it comes to faith and confidence and trust in institutions and their leaders. It cuts across party and ideological lines, whether one is a Trump supporter, Bernie Sanders supporter. There's a feeling among many that the country, sadly, is rigged for people with money and who are close to power. And for the rest of the people, it's a tougher situation. Again, that's the perception. But what's important is in a republic is we have to be responsive to that. So, what got me going on this project was just real concern. I grew up in a working class family and nobody had ever gone to college, but I grew up really just believing in the country and believing that it's possible, anything can happen. And I was the first one to go to college and went from there into the military. It was a way to escape poverty, frankly, to serve and to see the world. But now when I look at young folks coming of age today, and I'm talking like 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and they look around and they see such vitriol, polarization, divide, concern. But I must tell you that it is encouraging that on a lot of my stops at colleges and even at some high schools, their eyes are wide open. They see what's going on, but they are undaunted. These students, now maybe it's a selection bias as to who's showing up to my book events, but I'm telling you, they're ready. They are ready for their time, and they want to see this country really have its best days still in front of them. But what I wanted to tell you is that, so this book, thank you for those who supported the book. My wife's still selling some copies from an independent bookstore here, if those interested after the talk. And for those on Zoom, you can always, you can get it online. But my book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, is my report to you, having spent the last 3 years in deep research and much reflection about why it is that we're in the situation that we're in. And I think it's very important. I think across spectrum and perspectives and across other functionalities, for example, even in the self-help world, the first step is realizing you have a problem, is recognizing where you're at, and then you can find a way forward from there. The Spirit of Philadelphia is my report to you. It is the history of our country told through ideas. And in some ways, it's a cautionary tale about what can happen when the spirit actually goes dormant. But in other ways, it's very encouraging because the book is basically in thirds. The first third is really taking a step back, and I'll explain why I do that. It's really about mostly philosophy, the first third. The second third is about history, about what our country has gone through the last 200 plus years, 250 years. And then the third section of the book is what should we do? From a better grounding in history and ideas, what is it that we could do as a people? What can we do with our representatives in terms of reforms, policy reforms that would help us recover, reawaken the spirit of Philadelphia? So what I want to do is I want to give you a sense of this. I'm going to sketch it, but I really want to have a dialogue. I want to hear what's on your mind, go through your comments and questions. And the same with those out on Zoom is I have really grown a lot doing these. I've done now over 60 of these events over the past 9 months, and I'm looking forward to this. Let me just start with the definition, right? Because when the book's called The Spirit of Philadelphia, it really begs the question, what exactly is spirit? And there's many different definitions. I think in relevance to this effort right here, spirit is this coalescing energy that humans, our species, were able to really connect with when we work together on difficult tasks. And I'm talking about anywhere, whether you're in the military or maybe in a club somewhere in the greater Grahamsville area, working on a farm, or in Washington, D.C., when representatives are in Congress. What we have found is that when our species, when we come together and work hard on a shared common purpose and we achieve it, it creates something, it creates a psychological community, and it actually portends well for other endeavors. So, when I've done these in the past, I've given the example. I'm 61. I've given the example what happened in 1980. When we had a bunch of above average hockey players that were such severe underdogs, and they went on to win the gold. But I'm speaking to you today with this big victory for our country. First time since 1980, although we weren't quite the underdogs that we were in 1980. But the point is that I remember that feeling for our country. I hope that maybe today can be the start of this. But I'm also realistic that there's so much more that has occurred and much more work that has to be done. But I want to tell you that I think just about everyone's felt this coalescing energy at some point in your life, whether it be in school or at work or in some kind of organization. But what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 was very important to our country, because we're not always taught this in school, but we were very close to failing. We were not the United States of America, that we were not really a nation at that point. What we were was a confederacy. There's no complete analogy to what we were from 1776 when we declared our independence. We had to fight to win it, by the way. The British left Yorktown in 81. The peace is concluded in 1783. And we were under the Articles until 1788 when we got the ninth state to ratify it. But we were free and independent states, 13 of them. And we came together in a confederation. But what that meant is states could actually coin their own money. States could actually enter into their own agreements, and they were being tempted. There were other nations that were trying to get our states to join security and trade agreements with states. And one of the challenges we had with what our endeavor, what our framework was, is we required all 13 states to agree or nothing changed. And they realized this is no good. We can't have that as the threshold. We need it to be significant. We need it to be serious, that people know that there is a emergent majority that wants to change, but it can't be all 13. For example, when they met in Philadelphia, Rhode Island didn't even send delegates. Didn't even send them, because they thought if we don't send delegates, then there's no changes, which was part of the problem, because all of the stipulations in the articles didn't require anybody to send money into the central endeavor, the central government then, the Confederacy. So when you had situations like Shays' Rebellion, and you had other situations where you needed some resources that we were sharing to address problems, any number of them, that just weren't there. And so the founders knew if we do nothing, we're just going to crumble. And, in my research, I went back over all 85 Federalist Papers. I'd read them earlier in my life, but going through them again was so instructive because of what we've all been through now. To having reread them, the first 20 are almost like all fixated on how important union is, how important it is. They didn't take it for granted that the Constitution was going to be ratified at all. They knew there were choices. And we, through our history, we learned the North and South, right? The Civil War. But they actually envisioned possibly 4 different scenarios. One was a good one, that everybody signs up for this. But they also envisioned other scenarios where maybe one state doesn't join. And there was a scenario where maybe the mid-Atlantic states don't join. And then, of course, there was this regional North-South thing. So they were really making a strong set of arguments as to why we should put behind us the Confederacy and become a nation. All their efforts had failed, including the previous one in Annapolis in 1786. And James Madison, among others, were starting to get concerned that maybe this is not going to work out. He asked Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was serving in Paris, he said, I need some help. He said, you got to get me everything you can get your hands on, every volume, a classic that can help us. Please send it to us. Perhaps one of the best gifts in our country's history, Jefferson did come through. He sent over 200 volumes to Madison. He sent it in a big trunk, and Madison devoured those works. He sent it to other people. What they were going to do was something different in Philadelphia. They were not going to try to do it what we would call today political, right? Political is you got a problem, let's sit down, everybody airs their point of view, let's see if we can figure something out. Every time they tried to do that, it failed, it didn't work. So they were going to try, in the book I described this as the indirect approach. Look, I do acknowledge just about everything in life is political. So I'm not saying it's devoid of politics. What I'm saying is they deliberately took a different approach, and they said, we're actually going to take a philosophical approach. We're going to ask one question first, which is, who are we? Who are we as a species? Who are we as humans? And then from that platform, they were going to make decisions about power, how we're going to array power. And what the founders concluded was that if we're being brutally honest with ourselves, we're conflicted as a species. You know, because there was an argument. Some philosophers actually said, like there was one, J.J. Rousseau said, actually humans are good. And then they become really tainted by civilization. He argued, you know, man becomes corrupted by civilization. Then there were some like Thomas Hobbes who said, no, humans are all bad. And because of that, you need a strong monarch and you need absolute power, and the king's got to keep people in line, or we're going to deal with perpetual civil war. That's the nasty Brutus and Short argument of Thomas Hobbes. And then there was John Locke, who actually thought that and they're influenced by John Locke here. Locke says, you know what? Humans definitely have that dimension. We can be selfish. We can be very self-interested. We can even be brutal, but humans are actually open to being good to others, if for no other reason, hopefully for the right reasons, right? Hopefully because we enjoy we want to be moral, yes, but for no other reason, for your self-interest. This is what we're taught when we're young, the golden rule. If you treat somebody nice, maybe they'll be nice to you. Locke calls that reciprocation. So the founders landed there. They believe that humans are actually conflicted, that yes, we're capable of extraordinary love, even sacrifice if we're called to it. But if we're being very candid, we know that we have a side of us that we hope doesn't show up. And if it does, maybe we can somehow hide it or curtail it, right? Why this is so important is regardless if you're John Adams, or if you're Thomas Jefferson, or you're James Madison, or you're Alexander Hamilton, if you've seen the musical, you know how much Hamilton and Madison, you know, these guys completely disagree on like 90% of issues. But they agreed on this philosophy. They agreed that humans are conflicted, and therefore that power needed to be treated in a certain way, or we were going to be abused. Power needed to be decentralized, separated, and then held transparent and accountable. And that's why it looks like it almost looks anal. When you read our Constitution, it's like checks. But they did it for a reason. It came from this conclusion that we needed this for us to be able to live in a flourishing way. Now, what about the convention in the spirit? Well, inauspicious start. First of all, 10 days, they didn't even have a quorum. So it's like, oh my gosh, this is our last shot. We can't even then they get a quorum. Then for 3 weeks after the quorum, they're right back to the same issue. They can't seem to get over the hump. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the two major arguments from the populous states. This was the so-called Virginia plan, or from the small states. That was Patterson from New Jersey. And these guys had different visions on how we were going to array power in the legislature until this guy, Roger Sherman, comes forward. And he says, well, why don't we try this? And he makes an argument for a bicameral legislature. Remember, we had a single one under the Articles, one chamber. They said, why don't we go with 2 chambers? And why don't we have the House, the People's House, be by population? So the big states are happy. We're going to do this by population. So the big states we're going to have good representation. Okay, hold on. Now the upper house, each state's going to be treated the same. They're all going to get two US senators. The whole point of it is that everybody got something and no one got everything they wanted. And nobody really had to give up anything. They had to just accept not getting everything that they wanted. And I would add one other thing in my research that an intangible was having Washington there. You know, Washington had served as George Washington was our commander in chief during the Revolutionary War. And then at the end of it, there was a very unfortunate event that happened. You know, the Army hadn't been paid for about a year and a half, and soldiers were understandably upset about that. And so the word percolated, and there was some historians are still torn about who was involved in this, but the letter gets to George Washington. And basically what they're suggesting to him is, you know, General, why don't you just go down to Annapolis, which is where the Continental, why don't you just take charge? Just take a pass and then also solve these other problems. So you see, pass and then take care. So there was some self-interest in the Army floating this letter up to the general to basically do a coup on the Continental Congress. And this is where Washington, you may know of this event, where he puts his spectacles on and he says, you'll have to forgive me because I've grown weary in the defense of this country. And he basically we're told that he says, I did not wage war when George III become George I. And so he actually gets on his horse, he goes to Annapolis and he turns in his commission and he goes back to Mount Vernon, stays there. And even all these times when the leaders are trying to resolve this issue with the articles, Washington stays on the farm until he hears about Shays. He knew Daniel Shays. He'd known him since he was 18. He fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He rose to the rank of captain. Washington knew him as a good and honorable man. When he heard Daniel Shays picked up arms against the country, he said, okay, we get this in some handwritten letters from Washington. I mean, he basically says, okay, I'm coming. I'll come to Philadelphia. And what had happened there is, as I mentioned, the states were not required to send in revenue, but some states really wanted it to work out. Massachusetts was one of them. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts really was anxious to see this new Confederacy. So they were making their people pay so that they could send it to the Confederacy. Well, they showed up at Shays. He's not actually too very far from here. He was in the westernmost county of Massachusetts. And the folks who were responsible for collecting the money showed up at his estate, at his farm, and they knocked on his door and they said, you know, we're here to collect your money so that we can. And he said, I'm happy to give it to you. You need to pay me first, what you owe me. I'm going to give it right back to you. And of course, this can happen in government. Of course, the people there say, look, we don't know anything about that. You need to give us the money. And Shays is like, well, then I'm going to fight you. He had so much integrity that his neighbors around, like Daniel Shays, so they took up arms. And this is what we learned in school is the Shays Rebellion. Why it's significant to this story is Washington comes off the farm, and why it's important to the spirit is regardless of where you were on the Jefferson and Adams debate, whether you believed in agrarian future or a commercial future, they all wanted Washington's respect. And so I think when Sherman offers this, my read of this is when Sherman offers the compromise, Washington is basically looking at him like, you think anybody thinks got a better idea? And they actually vote for the compromise. They finally get through. And here's what they didn't expect. It changed the mood of the entire convention. And you may have had some experiences in your own life where you've been dealing with people in the past and it's like banging heads and everything. And all of a sudden you agree on something and it just changes. They came in shortly thereafter and they started working on Article 2, which was on the presidency. Oh my gosh, that was an issue that was sure going to go red hot because so many of the delegates didn't want to have a King George again. So, but once they actually agreed on Article 1, they actually made fairly easy, not completely, but they made fairly easy work of Article 2. And then they went on to do Article 3. You know, we take it for granted, our independent judiciary. It'd been theorized. Montesquieu wrote about it in The Spirit of Law. Nobody had ever in the history of the world had ever done it. We did. Now, if you think they were nervous about that, we got a judge in the room here too. They were nervous about it. So that's why if you read your Constitution tonight, if you go home, you'll see Article 1, pretty long. Because they felt pretty good about that. That's the people's house. That's the legislature. Article 1 deals with the Congress. Article 2 is the presidency. Okay, they had an idea. That's still fairly lengthy, about half the size of Article 1. Article 3, short. They were really worried they're going to screw it up. And so Article 3 is there, establishing the independent judiciary. But what we know today, really, it's only because it was fleshed out by the Judiciary Act of 1790 and then the Marbury versus Madison key Supreme Court decision, which was not utterly challenged by the other branches. That's what gives us today, really, what was then the first time in history, an independent judiciary. Before that, your judges were always an extension of the crown. That's what they, in fact, even today, if you saw some of the news in Great Britain about the ambassador, even Andrew, former Prince Andrew, being charged, you notice that's actually the crown versus, because it's actually still to this day in Great Britain, the whole judiciary branch is an extension of the crown. We had actually done it differently. And what we found, the founders were surprised by this spirit of Philadelphia, that it created a sense of common purpose and this coalescing energy. And, that philosophy, actually, it stood with us until the Civil War. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but you can read it in the book. But it's Abraham Lincoln, when he's murdered, this is when we never again have a common philosophy. Now, if you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you know that one of the themes in Game of Thrones is who's the rightful heir. Right? I don't know if maybe the analogy is falling short here, but the whole point is that there were attempts of intellectuals to make arguments that they were the rightful heir of common sense realism, which was this common philosophy. But we never really, to this day, we've not had a common philosophy. There are philosophies and then there's ideologies. And actually, liberalism and conservatism nested. They are ideologies nested under common sense realism. And today, we no longer have that common sense of who we are as a species and what we should do with power. Because what's happened over time, it's really been the last 125 years, is we've centralized power over time. We've centralized it really in the office of the presidency, and particularly in one person, the president. And by second order effect, that's impacted our teamwork, and it's dampened and really caused our spirit to go dormant. And, obviously today we're meeting in 2026. There are strong opinions on this, right? People are either really liking the idea that one person is doing things or they're really not liking it, right? And the point is, over time, we've done this. And incidentally, I want to say that this was not malice. I would do town hall meetings and I would meet folks and they were convinced that they were right. Not only was the other side wrong, but they were actually evil. And they said that they're actually trying to wreck our country. That's not what my research found. My research found there was actually good intentions why we did this. What happens in the late 1800s is there are folks who say, look, we're in this accelerated industrial age. We've had enormous technological change. We've had urbanization, modernization. Those founding ideas, even if they were right, they're not right for today. And by having so many checks and balances and having power so separated, we're getting in our own way. We can do so much more good for people if we just allow ourselves to be centralized and to move faster. I have a great extensive commentary about that in the book, but the reality is today is that regardless of party, by the way, one party tries to say that it's regardless of party, there is an effort when the president comes in to effectuate a policy agenda by fiat, by executive orders and actions and bureaucratic rules, when the intention of the founders is that we, the people, through our representatives, would have to meet in Congress, debate ideas, work it through in legislation. That's why we coined this thing. We are a nation of laws, right? But I say polemically in the book that it's really a question whether or not we still are, because we do so much political change today by fiat that it can be undone in a New York minute. Then as soon as another president comes in, they can undo all those orders and we're right back at Jump Street. And yet we've wildly oscillated and we've caused a lot of internal challenges. So that's a sketch of what's going on. But I want to tell you the last third of the book is what we can do about it. 4 goals. 4 goals. The first one is how do we restore trust and faith and confidence in us, in our ability to be self-governing? Because today we don't have that. And again, it's regardless of the ideological spectrum, people believe the system's rigged one way or another and for different purposes. And so I make an argument for a series of reforms of things we can do. Some of these are electoral. It's like term limits, it's independent redistricting, it's campaign finance reform, There's also trade and tax reform coming from the people's representatives. All of that is intended. I think Americans are very realistic. They know they're never going to have abject equality. I mean, that's so idealistic. But what people in America, regardless of ideological perspective, want to believe is that our system is basically fair. They want to believe it's basically fair. And right now, that's just not a feeling that people have. Whether you're a Trump, critic or a Trump supporter, that's one thing they agree on is things seems rigged. It's unfair. And I wish I could tell you, I told you I came from working class. I wish I could tell you it's not rigged. That just wasn't my experience down there. I saw it too many times. I saw what happened when lobbyists are running around and these things get done, and they get done in the dark of the night, and they're in 1,000-page bills, and they're put in there, and it's just not good for us, for we the people. And that's only when we're doing it through law, let alone what can be done through executive order. You can imagine donors to certain campaigns and what can be done in executive order. So I think what we have to do is we got to recognize that we need to restore trust first, and then to reawaken the spirit. Welcome. Mr. Rush, how are you? Good to see you. Yeah, Army veteran right here, and of course, a local celebrity. So anyways, what I want to say is that's that first goal, restoring trust. I have a series of reform recommendations there. The second one is the spirit. How do we reawaken the spirit? Well, we need to rebalance our institutions. And I wish I could tell you this was a heist. In most cases, not all, this was not a heist. This wasn't the president coming and taking powers. In some cases that happened. This was mostly the Congress pushing this off onto the executive branch. And the reason why they did it is it was easier for their reelect. Like on the solemn decision on the use of force, we were always meant to have a say in that. Because, the founders were really concerned about, they'd seen what happened with King George, and they didn't want to have any part of that, and that marauding. King's just doing what they want. They wanted us to be involved. But actually, if you're a member of Congress, that's a tough vote. Because if you take the wrong vote, you can get fired. Well, yeah, you all are at risk of losing your job too. But most of the members don't want to do that. And so they're just as happy for the president to make that call. There are some exceptions to this, but the preponderance of the members prefer to have the executive make the call, because if it ends up going well, they can say, hey, I was behind that. And if it hasn't gone well, they can shin kick the president. And we can't allow that to happen. That's just one example. There are other examples. This whole thing on tariffs, this is illustrative. This is illustrative because the founders explicitly gave that power to the people's representatives. And why are we in this today? There's a couple laws that confuse the matter. There was a 1916 law that was done that Woodrow Wilson signed, and it was a 1977 law that gave emergency powers to the president. So the Constitution makes it clear on appropriations. No appropriation shall last beyond the 2 years of the Congress. You have to do it again, right? What I argue is that we should do this for emergency powers. Emergency powers should sunset. That doesn't mean they can't come back. If they're that important, Congress can debate it and put it back in place when they come back in. But and you can have maybe a 60 or 90-day period where the new Congress has a chance to vote. But if they don't vote, then the emergency power sunsets. Because we're dealing with this whole issue today the courts decided on. When I say decided on, they did decide on it, but honestly, they didn't fully decide on it. They basically said, well, that particular law, which was the 1977 law that I'm referring to, that he's overextended. Now he's claiming a new law, but the whole point of this is that we could make this, we the people, if Congress reclaims this responsibility, we would find ourselves in a better place because we would have to work together on this. So there's a series of different reforms that I have in that chapter that deals with how do we reawaken the spirit. And then I actually have the third goal is about us. I have a chapter called, I go there. It's called Notes for Us, We the People. Because we got to own some of this too. The founders intended that we would be self-governing, that we would be educated, informed, and engaged, all three. And there are different definitions for all three. And today we're in a situation where, again, regardless of party, we want our elected leaders to give us everything we want. We want it right now, and we don't want to pay for it. Coming from working, my dad was in a union. I'm all for, I spent my time representing, trying to help working class people. But, if you want to give tax free tips, which I think you could do, Absolutely, you should pay for it in another way in the tax code. And the problem today is regardless of party, we have leaders and we're responsible for this because we look for the person who pledges, I'm going to give you unicorns and rainbows. I'm going to give it to you like the first day I'm in office and you're never going to have to pay for it. And we know from growing up that when our parents tell us if it seems too good to be true, it's probably not true, right? And so here we are, $38 trillion in debt. We've got a whole set of issues. This is only just an illustration. I mean, let me give you one last point on this, and it's this, that arguably, in relation to say 150 years ago, we've never seen so much wealth and connectivity. I mean, yes, we have poverty, there's no doubt, and we're in the Catskill Mountains, we know this, right? But relation to 150 years, we got running water, we got all kinds of a lot of nice things, and connectivity. We've got, my goodness, we've got 24/7, we've got cable, we've got, internet, we have email, we have cell phones, we have social media. In an age we've arguably never been more connected. We've never seen higher levels of isolation, alienation, and despair. That's a conundrum. How do we explain that, right? And I think the answer is we're looking for answers in the wrong places. We have to realize that I've met people who are like, Chris, I don't understand. I've had all these achievements and I feel like something's missing. And it's like, maybe you should look into that. I think as we don't fully understand, there's a mystery to our species. We have a mind, body, spirit dimension. For me, that's God. It doesn't have to be. It can be something else, but there's something mysterious about us as a species. And if we're not addressing the mind, body, and spirit, if we're not addressing that, we're going to have issues. That's part of the reason why I think we're out of balance. So I do go there in the book. The last of the 4 goals is who do we need now as leaders? And I make an argument in the book that the kind of leaders, different times call for different leaders. And right now, we're in an age where we're so out of balance between the now and the future. Of course, we live in the now. The now matters, right? Of course it matters. But in balance to what's coming and to our children and grandchildren and talking resources now and the future. We're also out of balance between the material and the spirit. We are out of balance between the individual and the obligations we have to others in the greater good. The founders understood this. They talked about this in the Federalist Papers. They talked about this sense, that what we call the greater good, right? And that's the reason why representatives, that's why they chose a republic. They chose a republic consciously because in history, pure democracies ended up with a real problem. I mean, they put Socrates to death. That was a jury of a democratic nature that put him to death. The republic was supposed to be citizens who were educated, informed, and engaged, and representatives who refined and enlarged our views. Because sometimes we move really quickly to that shiny object towards that short term, when in fact it may not even be good for our long term. And then there's the issue of what we share together, our commonality and our common good. So the kind of leaders we need right now help us with this. They have a voice. We all have sort of what I call in the book the Lockean voice, which is Lockean liberalism. But the other dimension is our communitarian being our sense of greater good. And we, at the outset of our country, we had a balance between these two voices. It's like any language. If you took a language in high school, and if you haven't spoken it since high school, it's probably atrophied to a degree, right? And we haven't spoken this language of, how long has it been since we've had a president say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for you? It's been a long time because we have these from both parties. We got these candidates who argue, I'm going to give you everything. And we need leaders now who I argue should come from that sector. People at this moment, we need a leader either from, possibly healthcare or from the military, first responder, even like clergy. We need somebody who spent their whole life serving others so that we can find that voice, so that we can restore balance between the individualism and the communitarian spirit. Both of those need to be together and sit side by side in unresolved tension, by the way. Too often as Americans, we look for solutions. And my wife will remind me, as a male, we're really bad for this. We want to solve problems when people raise it. But sometimes these things are meant to be in healthy tension. They actually help us going forward. So that is a sketch of the spirit. There's so much more to it, but I hope you'll read it. And I hope that you'll think about it. And when I've done these in the past, what I've recommended is like, after you've read it and you find like-minded souls in your community, talk about it with them. And the way we can do this organically is if we reach out to our representatives and we say, we got to have change, because right now we're on an arc that's heading towards real peril. I mean, more than even today. More than even today. And we have it within us. We can change ARC. That's the thing about a free people, is we can do this. I absolutely believe we can do this, but we have to take the moment seriously. So that's my sketch to you. I hope you'll read it. And I have done some Zooms with groups to follow up when folks have wanted to do, like when they've gotten together in small groups, and I'm willing to do that as well, to stay engaged. I've been traveling the country and doing some of these, and I want to keep this going because I believe our best days are still in front of us. So how about reactions? We'll go to Zoom too. We're going to give you a shot, but let me go to the room here and see what kind of questions and comments that you have. AJ, you had some? Go ahead.
I don't know if this is appropriate or not. I was a pretty good student in high school.
Yeah.
I lived through 1977 and 78.
Yeah.
I was dying to find out that this tariff law that President Trump relied upon to enforce.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's happening in that time frame?
Yeah. So there was a couple things. First of all,
excuse me, Chris, could you restate that question?
Oh yeah, I sure can. I sure can. Great question. It's from AJ from Fallsburg. And, you know, he's asking about, because he's been following the current issues, what's going on today. And he understood rightly that the authority that the president was claiming most immediately was a 1977, essentially an emergency powers law that allowed for the president, by exception, to do what constitutionally the people's representatives are supposed to be doing, which are the tariffs. And he was asking, what was the evolution? You know, how did this happen? I can tell you this, in part, what had happened is this actually started with a 1916 law, and the law was starting to be questioned. People are like, you know, okay, so in 1916, they were making an argument that the founders were so far removed from 1916 that maybe the Congress shouldn't be doing tariffs. Maybe it should be, now that there's a world war. We weren't quite in it yet. But there was a feeling that our president needed to move faster, and, you know, we wanted to make good calls on tariffs and on trade in general. And so they delegated to Woodrow Wilson the authority to make these calls. And what happened over time is by 1977, you had folks saying, wait a minute, the argument in 16 was it was a long time ago. So how do we know this 1916 law is even relevant today? After all, that was a period of war, at least worldwide, even if we didn't join till the next year. And so Carter, at the time, recognizing the challenges, remember, Jimmy Carter was also going through some challenges inside his own party. I mean, he was a reformist. And the union leaders, unions were stronger in 76, 77 than they are today, although there may be some kind of renaissance possibly coming. But at least in 76 and 77, part of his own base of support was questioning. We know that ultimately there's going to be a challenge inside his own party. That's coming a few years later in Teddy Kennedy. But Carter's advisors were telling him that one way you can shore up some support among the unions is if you make an argument that we need a new law as far as the president taking action on trade. So, because really tariffs in general, a lot of the unions do find short-term interest in tariffs because they can be protective of industry. So this was actually good politics among some of the advisors for the Carter administration to help him with a part of his base that he was viewed as not particularly strong. You know, there were some other international pieces. We were dealing with inflation. You remember the whole Gerald Ford thing? He was whip inflation now. Well, he loses. I mean, Carter wins that election in November of 76. Carter comes in 77. And, you know, we're still dealing with inflation in the 70s. And, you know, one of the things they're trying to do to address concerns of working class people is saying, well, you know, these tariffs can help our local industry. Because remember, in 76 and 77, we're not really into the information age yet. All the supercomputers come in 69, we don't get the information age for probably another 15. We start to get some of this in the defense industry in the 80s, the DARPA and stuff like that, but we don't start feeling it, we the people, until the late 80s, really the 90s, when you start to feel this. So, you know, this is a moment where they put this, and Congress does give it to them. They give them the bill, and so it's basically a conversation with the courts saying, I know you guys are getting a little bit wobbly on the president having this authority. We just gave you a new law. But the problem in the current context this week was, you know, when they see what they'll do, what the courts will do, they'll actually go back to the minutes, things that were spoken in the Congress when they were debating it. And the one thing they couldn't find was any evidence that we're going to do this to everyone. Because remember, that's one of the issues that happened in April of 2025 is the tariff was global. And so it was too expansive. And that's why they rendered the decision this week where they come down and they say, look, this is too expansive. If you're going to try to do this, you need to point to another statute and another section. So you notice that's what he did, like later that afternoon. He pointed to 2 other sections in a different law that provided the story. By the way, that's going to be challenged too. He's missing, I get it, what's happening here. There's this tension that's going on. Do you want to follow up to that question?
Well, one thing I can comment on, and not to be political about this per se, but there's such acrimony between the mere fact that Trump exists as president, no matter what the issue, there's going to be challenges to it, regardless of whether or not it's for the better good or not. And it's just a shame, as you say, that the only reason is because.
Yeah. I mean, so what the book argues, because the book really takes a step back and is engaging ideas. So it's neither pro-Trump nor critical of Trump. It's really saying this is what's happened to us over time. So we should realize the dynamic. So as it relates to this dynamic, I think what we've got to realize is that, you know, emergencies generally don't last for decades. And what we ought to do is have a sunset on the emergency, because then we can actually have a real conversation. And if we get out of the addiction to having to do everything by fiat, because, you know, in my time, so I know it was a decade ago, but, you know, I used to walk, as you know, I was very active. I'd go to all these communities and everything. I'd have folks come up to me, and I'm remembering particularly in Jeffersonville, that's in Schoharie County, and a guy came up to me, and wonderful guy, 75 years old, great shape, obviously a farmer, and he was red in the face. He was yelling at me. He was yelling, impeach Obama. Oh, he's yelling it at me. And I'm like, okay, for what? And it took him, what he said basically is he's doing too many executive orders. So, okay, that was a decade ago. And now, you know, we're well past the numbers, right? These is a record number of executive orders and action. So, and we're talking 180-degree flip in terms of the partisan. That's why I'm very clear that my research points to the fact this is a dynamic that transcends partisan, even ideological. It's really about this notion of power. Like, how should we go about resolving matters in general? And what the founders said is not only should we array power this way, but we should all find a way to make sure we all agree on the dispute resolution mechanism. Because that's the thing. If you all agree on the dispute resolution mechanism, then you can go to the courts, they make the resolution on it, and then you know what you say? Okay, we're going to live with it, and then we're going to fight you in the election, but that's 2 years from now. For right now, we're going to work together and do what we can, and then we can, because I want to be clear in the book, 2 things. One is it's not about going back. This talks about the founding principles, but it's not about going back. You can never go back. That's a complete fiction. You can only go forward. What I'm arguing in the book is these are the principles we should go forward with because of all of recorded history. Nobody's got it closer to right for our species than what we did then. And so once you have a way that you can actually deal with power, and keep in mind, I am not talking about, and ironically, what undid this was their inaccurate, their faulty assumption on slavery. That's what undid this. Because if you set aside slavery, Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln agreed on common sense realism. The problem, slavery, the founders actually, if you read Federalist 42, Federalist number 42, the Federalist paper,
Madison says, weren't we genius? Basically, we have set slavery on a path for extinction. And we got the South to ratify the Constitution. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to get all 13 states to ratify. And that's why they have the statement on importation ban, 1808, is they believe that between that and that same year, they passed the Northwest Ordinances, which clarified that the Congress said you shall not bring slavery into the new territories. They thought we put this on a path that's going to become extinct. So, you know, it's what I call in the book a first order moral question. Because you could argue today we have another one. And so I try to make sure I deal with that at least somewhat. But the point is common sense realism actually starts with a constitution that is itself a compromise meant to drive compromise. And so when slavery ended up not becoming extinct, even Thomas Jefferson says in 1820, when the Congress is debating the Missouri, what we know today as the Missouri Compromise, he says this is the fire bell in the night, because he realizes that the assumption was wrong. Because what did the system do when it came under stress? Did exactly what we expected it to do. It started producing compromise. We got the Compromise of 1820, we got the Compromise of 1850, we got the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The system did what it was supposed to do, which was take input, find. But the problem is, how do you compromise a first order moral question? You got to have resolution on that. So, you know, so on the matter of, you know, how personal things are today, I think the key is to try to re-embrace this idea of a republic, that representatives have responsibilities, we, the people, have responsibilities, and we need to sort this through. We have to trust in the system with these dispute resolution mechanisms. I mean, part of what tore most recently was, regardless of how you feel about the 2020 election, the thing of it is, the justices did speak on this. And again, I'm not taking a position on the normative question. What I am saying is the system is set up this way. You campaign, you vote, you count votes, maybe you recount votes, you go to the courts if you think something's wrong, and then ultimately Supreme Court speaks, and you wrap a bow around that, and that's our system. Doesn't mean you like it. You can say, I don't like it, and I don't even think, but that's the system. You stop, because that's what we all sign up for, and then you say, you know what, we're going to come at you again in the next election. But when you undo the process, then it's all up in the air. And that's part of what we're dealing with. And now you notice with the decision, this court arguably is the most conservative court since the 1920s. Most of their decisions on those matters was 9-0 on most of those decisions. The courts were saying, look, you ran this because, you know, the Trump campaign, they could certainly stress test this, you know, particularly in Pennsylvania, because you had COVID, and these were stipulations that were changed to deal with COVID. They were right to challenge that in court, but the courts then spoke. See, they spoke once the courts looked at it, because, you know, they were trying to make an argument that this was supposed to come from a particular aspect of the Pennsylvania government. So they made an argument, and the judges all looked at this, and they ultimately rejected it. That was then elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said, no, I mean, it's done. So that's part of what we're trying to recover now, is this sense that we have a shared sense of dispute resolution mechanism. And that's part of what the ambiguity that's causing a lot of challenge. So we can still do this. We can recover this, but we have to recognize. To your point, though, I see your point that you're making. I see the point that you're making, that because of the person who's occupying the White House, we sort of go to our corners and we're either pro or anti, and that really stands in the way of an extended substantive debate.
No intermediate leadership that's trying to resolve this in any way.
Mm.
So rather fight
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. So I'm sorry, you people are listening to AJ's just following up, and we're essentially working this through, and AJ's making points of concern as we go forward. So let me go now to Zoom. How do we do this? How do I take one question from Zoom?
Wait, there's a question by Stephen Call. So he's, go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead, Steve.
Hi. In full disclosure, I'm a semi-retired college professor, history. Grew up on a farm. working class family, union class family. One of the things that I've been concerned about for a number of election cycles is when you look at a national or state, upstate New York, election results by county, what you see invariably is a sea of red interspersed with a few islands of blue. And those islands of blue represent urban areas. And invariably, the trend is that the urban areas have so many people they can outvote the rural areas. And I live in a rural area to this day. Oh, by the way, I also spent 20 years as an Air Force pilot, B-52 pilot. So I've lived most of my life in rural areas, and yet I feel like I've been disenfranchised. I might as well not even go to the polling booth because downstate New York is going to outvote all of upstate. Um, I'm, and this is a national trend as well. I mean, there are elections where the entire nation is a vast carpet of red with only a dozen or so islands of blue. How do we resolve this? How do
Yeah.
we give? Oh, one other point I want to make, if I could. Back in Philadelphia, 1787, rural and urban were relatively balanced. We've lost that. I think that's a fundamental. I know one colleague who said, land does not vote. Geography does not vote. It's people who vote. Well, to me, land, the countryside involves far, far more communities than the urban communities that outvote us. And so you get a few communities who have a very different mindset from us rural communities, and yet we've essentially been rendered voiceless.
Okay, yeah. So fair point, Steve. I can imagine it must have been awesome to be in your classroom. Uh, so, look, I mean, this is part of what Woodrow Wilson was talking about in the late 19th century. Among the things he said would rapid change, one of them was urbanization. So you do point to that. We did see the percentage of those who lived, for example, during the founding, I mean, close to over 90% of people lived in the rural economy. They lived on farms. And that's why it was not uncommon to have multiple generations at the time. And what I won't get into right now is that actually impacted their whole philosophy on education. But at any rate, on your question or phenomenon that you're raising, I mean, we're going to have as a people, sincerely, I mean, one of the things I try to do is not skirt the really hard issues in this book. I mean, we have to come to terms with what you're saying. I mean, the reality is today that California wants, I'm talking the state now, because I'll get down to the local level. California wants Louisiana to look like California, and Louisiana wants California to look like Louisiana. And, there's a saying when we were growing up, not everything is a federal case. And I
Yeah.
think we do have to realize that, the basic setup of our country was that we were a republic with two major principles. One was democratic principles and the other was constitutional, and they complemented each other. So that the reason why that democratic principle was so important is majorities would set the arc of policy, not necessarily every letter of a law, but the arc of policy, but that the stipulations, both stated in implicit and explicit, would protect minorities. And here I'm not talking about minorities in terms of demographics, although that does come into play. I'm talking about minorities, people who don't have a minority viewpoint. So they were protected because majorities couldn't just vote to take away your Fourth Amendment right. They couldn't say, well, we don't like that, so you don't get it right. Your search and seizure, you're just gonna have to deal with search and seizure. No, our republic said that was sacrificed.
Chris, I don't know, we just lost you.
do that.
Hmm.
You saw my hands, they were up here. Yeah, this is like, what, those 18 minutes missing from the tape, right? No, I mean, the point is here that we have to recognize that, I know that, and I'm a huge Lincoln fan. I mean, you can just search my name. You see, I just published 4 essays on him in the last 6 weeks. A huge Lincoln fan. But the idea that that issue is closed, the issue that once you join a union, you can never leave. I mean, that we can't have that. I mean, Jefferson, think about when in the course of human events, right? Think of just the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We assert. That's a document we're going to celebrate the 250th year. We say when it comes in the course of human events, if we're going to have to dissolve bands, political bands that unite us, a curious world wants to know. We should give the reasons that move. I mean, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea that we solve this, that you can never leave, that's just a recipe potentially for more violence in the future. Now, I'm for union. I think we're better off together. As long as we have a managed expectations of what the union does. The union does things like today, like we just had a hockey team that won that gold. The union helps us with trade. The union helps us with deterrence, right? The union can help with certain things and certainly protect rights. But the union can't solve every political problem. We need to allow this thing to move down. So I think that's the first thing I would tell you now. I haven't even answered your question. As it relates to communities, Steve, what I would say is that, look, I mean, what may be coming is you're starting to see some of this now, and there is some precedent for it in our country's history, is you may see some counties that decide to go to another state. And what I'm saying is if you believe in the union, you got to allow for people to sort through these issues. Incidentally, there's so much involved in this conversation. Like in New York State, for example, the reality is that the majority of revenues that come into New York State actually come from New York City. And I'm an upstate guy. I'm all for upstate, but the reality is a lot of those revenues come from the city, and then they're purposed and they're moved all around. That doesn't obviate what you're saying. I mean, I felt it myself. There are certain things that have been voted on in Albany that my wife knows. I mean, I'm like, my gosh. I mean, how does that even happen, right? But what I would tell you is to get to your basic question. I'll go back to you for rejoinder. Is I think that whether it's Idaho, because Idaho is going through this issue, and let's keep in mind Virginia went through this issue. Right? I mean, that's how we got West Virginia. West Virginia actually left, and that's a precedent, right? They left. Now, it was a time of war, but West Virginia actually was formed out of Virginia, which is interesting because you got to be careful the way you word that, because that's actually facially unconstitutional. But it was made to be acceptable because it was, after all, a rebellion. And so we have West Virginia. So now, does that mean that upstate New York may at some point decide to form a new kind of political union? Possibly. I mean, I don't think it should be ruled out. There has to at least be a pressure valve that allows people to feel like their voices can be heard. So that's what I would tell you, Steve, is I don't have a silver bullet for you, other than to say that what I take away, even though most of this book rests on the Constitution, I argue we carry the Declaration over. We carry it over with the founding of the United States of America. And part of that is the spirit of the idea that we still have a right to reorganize. What are your thoughts and what are your reactions to what I said?
Well, first of all, in my lifetime, and of course, before I joined the Air Force, with that 20-year period accepted, I've been a New Yorker, upstate New Yorker. And when I was in college, back in the mid-'70s, the situation you mentioned, where most of the tax money coming into New York State is coming from downstate, was just the opposite. When New York City was broke back in 74, 75, upstate New York voters were saying, hey, wait a minute, most of the money flowing into New York State comes from upstate, and so we're subsidizing New York City. The other thing I'd like to point out is, the second most famous line in the Constitution is, government derives its legitimate powers from the consent of the governed. And right now, in a lot of elections, I don't feel like I even get the chance to consent.
So one of the things, I definitely see this point. It's not the first time I've heard it either. I do think that, look, I mean, we have inherent in the array is the fact that we could always revisit how we go about doing this paradigm, if you will. Now, keep in mind, we have 2 states right now that do their electoral votes different from the other 48. So here we're talking about Nebraska and Maine. They actually will vote with the congressional districts. So, that's an example that New York State could decide a state can decide they're not going to give their votes unanimously. They could decide to apportion them by congressional district, but it would take grassroots to get involved. So to your point, I mean, if you wanted to help get people organized, that is something that I argue I believe it is now allowed for. But if somebody tried to say you were doing something seditious, I would be right there in your corner to say it's not. I mean, you have every right to make arguments about, what laws, how they're being made, how power's being arrayed. That was one of the things that came out of Philadelphia, is that there wasn't an ability to allow the articles to grow. There was no room to breathe. You needed all 13 states. This is a missed point often too, by the way. There's 2 missed points of the Constitutional Convention. And that's one of them, is that the founders, one argument you sometimes hear is that they never wanted any change after they left Philadelphia. That's actually just the opposite, because they said that we actually did want to have we wanted the Constitution to be able to breathe. Doesn't mean they wanted it to change willy-nilly. They wanted it to be a high bar, but they did wanted it to be able to be amended and not by unanimous. I think that's enough I've said on that. Steve, what I would say is at this point, given your wisdom and experience, I mean, if this is an issue, I would talk to your local representative and see if there's like-minded organizations, if you wanted to get involved in this kind of issue about talking about how you feel disenfranchised. Yeah. Yeah. And listen, I've had moments where I felt the same way. So, I mean, I think it comes with this idea that we take votes and then the majority moves the arc. But I think also we have to realize that at the end of the day, I argue that we're better off in union than not, because I look at look for all the angst in our country right now. Look at where the money goes. I mean, I have the saying that money doesn't lie. I know it's controversial, but what I'm saying is money goes where money makes money. So, if you look at Wall Street right now, we're such a divided country. There's dysfunction. Our government's partially shut down once again. I mean, there's all kinds of issues, right? But yet the stock market is going up. And why is that the case? I mean, in part because there's a land war in Europe. There's all kinds of issues in Asia, Middle East, God knows what. And so people with money around the world say, you know what, the best bet for my money is the United States of America. So for all of our warts and challenges, the world looks at us and says, you're still probably the best bet. And I think there's a decent argument to be made for that. And so what we ought to do as a people is realize, look, we got real issues. We're in an inflection point. And so we should talk about reform. My book, it really is about reform, but we should also realize we shouldn't throw the whole thing out. Because I think, we still offer more for the world than any place else. That's my personal view. I don't know how you feel on that, but did you have any last comment? You get last word on this subject.
I'd just say that what made the difference between when I was in college and upstate New York was funneling more money. And now where it's reversed is because we are so shackled to downstate that they've just sucked all the life out of the upstate economy. The only thing we export is our children.
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah. No, I mean, so the major restructuring that occurred in the economy when the industrial age moved to the information age really hurt us here in upstate New York, because so much of our economy was farming and manufacturing. I mean, we used to make sneakers in this state. I mean, we had lumber industry, we had all kinds of great industry, and we had awesome farms. We still have farms. They're more consolidated. They're still family farms, but now they're more consolidated, and the industry has largely left for a variety of reasons. And so that makes it hard particularly for upstate economies. That's why, there's been some symbiosis with parts of Pennsylvania, as you know, as far as some feelings of ways that you could grow the economy. So look, I mean, you sound like just the founders would have said, man, this guy might get involved, right? Because they were hoping folks like you would get involved. So so that we don't, there's always a chance for renewal. And I do thank you for everything, for your service to our country, to your service to the next generations, and for, being active on this call. Could have been so many other places, and you came on today, and I do appreciate it. I'm going to take one from the room here and go back. Go ahead, Mr. Kuhn.
So 20 years ago or so, I had the pleasure of listening to Alan Simpson, who said, when he was talking with Earth and Bowl, Simpson Bowl,
Yeah.
and he said, people asked him what was wrong in Washington and what's wrong with Congress, and he says, well, I can't tell you what's wrong, but I can tell you what's different. He said, Ted Kennedy and I could not be further from on political spectrums, and we would have great debates on the floor of the Senate. We'd retire to our office and we'd determine what's best for the country. We'd shake hands and we'd go do it. What's going to bring back that theory of people working together? And my thought is, at the end of the day, if gerrymandering was completely gone and districts were drawn, representative kind of 50-50, blue, we would have to find moderates.
So Mr. Coombe is basically giving a commentary and a question. It's essentially trying to get at why is it that our senior leaders in the Congress don't seem to be open to working through issues, having civil discourse, finding ways to accommodate. He was quoting particularly Senator Simpson, who was known to be a conservative senator from the West, who had a reputation also of being reasonable and working with folks. What happened? Why? How can we get that back? And he was referring to the Simpson-Bowles budget proposal that had come forward, which, by the way, I supported in my time in the Congress. I thought it was a reasonable approach to do something very responsible. So what I would say is two things. Mr. Coombe actually gave a suggestion, not just a question, but he also said, this issue of the way we decide the district boundaries. There's an illusion that we pick our representatives when too often actually representatives pick their voters. And they do this in a collusive manner, attended to the Constitution. When we have to count every 10 years, we go through a reapportionment and a redistricting process. And too often, for all the talk about partisanship, they actually get behind closed doors and they collude the parties and they draw lines to protect incumbents, right? And so that actually becomes a problem then, because they know they're not going to face a competitive election in the fall, but they could face a competitive election in the spring if they're seen as working with the other side. So at least their public face is going to be one of just bombastic and going after the other side, so they don't get fired in a primary, even if they know better in their own conscience. So I do think that's part of the solution. It is part of my book. It's one of several dozen policy recommendations, absolutely, for the independent redistricting. I also think we need to take a look at power itself. Because, if you're passionate, and we want people to be passionate, we want people to express themselves. That's one thing I want to be clear about the book too. We're not trying to homogenize thought. That's a great strength of this country, is the fact you can think what you want, say what you want. Those freedoms are awesome. And I'm telling you, I've served in the Middle East. I've been to places where that isn't the case, and you can't hear. So you want to keep that going. But, what we've got to do is we've got to realize that if you're passionate about an issue, and that means you want it done, and you got choices. I can do it the hard way. I can work with all these representatives, and I can, and maybe there'll be some compromise. Oh, I'm not going to be liking that, but at least it's better than what we have. You could go that way, or you could turn on your cable news of choice. If you're this way or that way, turn on your cable news of choice and find the most pure candidate that you got going. Maybe you're left, you're going on MS Now, whatever, and if you're right, you're going on Fox, or maybe even, America One, but all those things that are out there, right? And you're finding the most pure person, because they're not going to compromise. And too often, we, the people, were like, that's easier. Let's just elect somebody to president and then just clear the decks. Just let them do those executive orders and actions, and we'll get the policy we want. Those members are left going, because those members, they're going to get fired. They're going to get fired in a primary because they're like, there's so many complications. There's so many. No, we just want this. We want this. And the president said, it's easy. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to do it on day one. And we're going to, and the problem is that when reality, things are harder, right? And so when you actually start to say, but we have to work through this and we got to do this, you end up getting fired in a primary. So I think, yes, you need independent redistricting, but we also need to push power back down to the people through their representatives. We need to move away from those executive orders and actions. Yes, please.
Just have a council level real quick,
Yeah.
because we both know politics. Haven't been in primaries in my life.
Yeah.
The way it's changed, and it's germane to this is it's almost impossible to have a moderate, no matter what the district is, whether it's gerrymandered or not, ever get to the ballot, because in a primary, it's either the arch conservative or the arch liberal that gets out the vote. So
Yeah.
a small minority of the vote gets the person to run, and how do you deal with it?
So I do take this on too. I mean, so one of my recommendations, which I've been waiting for somebody to really kind of dig into, because I did it, I believed in what I was doing, but I also knew that it wasn't necessarily going to be the final answer. But I think we need to start. And that is what happened to us after the tumultuous year of 1968. It was, we had leaders murdered. It was a bad year for us. We were escalating in Vietnam. It was a tough year for us. And there was a feeling after the 68 situation, because the Democrats had Humphrey and he didn't really win primaries, right? I mean, Bobby Kennedy had won primaries. Other people had won primaries. McCarthy had won, not the 50s McCarthy, but another McCarthy on the left had won primaries. And yet the left was stuck with Humphrey. And then, so actually they did a commission, and it was called McGovern-Fraser. And the McGovern-Fraser came forward with a series of reforms that were well-intended, wanted to address the tumultuous year of 1968, but that's what gave us this modern day framework, which I argue is basically 365 perpetual campaigns. You just finished one campaign and now you're talking on another campaign. This comes out of McGovern-Fraser. It has to do with the primary system because, if you've watched this movie on LBJ, there's this comment where Woody Harrelson playing LBJ says, who cares about those primaries? Because it's going to be you're going to pick the person in the convention, because that's the way it was. It was actually done in the convention. So all that sort of collateral that you were describing was not an issue in 1968 and prior, because we had a whole different system. So what the reforms in the McGovern-Fraser were meant to address what was perceived by many as corruption. The idea that party bosses could do this in a smoke-filled room and give us Humphrey, instead of giving us the kind of candidate we were looking for. But there's been a lot of externalities, second order effects attendant to McGovern-Fraser that I'm actually arguing that we ought to try something different. So, I'm not going to sketch it all out for you now, but I basically come up with a concept that will get away from the perpetual campaigns. If you think about your elections in Europe, they generally last 6-8 weeks. That's about all they last. Here, they'll go forever. And I have a concept of how we can move away from that. What I also want to tell you, though, is that as somebody who served, I've been a founding principles guy since I was 18. I grew up in a union household. My family were all Irish Catholic Democrats. I was the first Republican in my family. These views I've had since I was 18. They come from coming out of a family. My dad was out of work. Throughout the 70s, it was a really traumatic time for our family. But I bring this up to say that I think that once you serve, just like art, when you create art, you don't own it anymore. You do a piece of art and people have interpretation. That interpretation matters. Maybe that's not why I did the painting, but it matters because they think it is. So I would meet people and they said, Gibson, you're a moderate and everything like that. And I just, it's like, that's their view. Now, I'm the same founding principles conservative I've been since I was 18 years old, but part of the founding principles conservative means that you listen. And that means that you recognize you're not going to get everything you want, and you need to work together, and you need to really effectuate law. But that doesn't mean I'm some squishy moderate. I have strong views, but it's just I don't get to superimpose them with fiat. I have to respect everybody's viewpoint, right? And my job to represent, even there were times I spoke on the floor where I would say, I need to share with you as a representative. There are views that I don't even hold, but they're important because to some of my people. So I would express that on the floor of the House. I'd say there are parts of my district that this is their view, and if I disagreed, I'd say I respectfully disagree and here's why, but I felt like I needed to represent it. I needed to say, this is something I'm hearing in my district. And I knew I was at peril because somebody can then, come after me for then that's the whole system. But I think if you only get into elected office to stay in elected office, it begs a first order question. Why are you there in the first place? You got to be there for a reason. You can't just be there to get perpetually reelected. And I think that's one of the reasons why I bring forward term limits, because I think the whole point is supposed to be service to others. So I did want to push back just a tad on this idea that moderates don't, because there were people on the right that criticized me because I was open to listen. but that didn't mean, I mean, I had principles, but I also thought my role as the founders envisioned was to be a representative. It wasn't to be a dictator, it was to be a representative. And so I acknowledge there were times when I would get critiqued from the right, but I didn't get defeated over that. So I think you have to be a strong person and have thick skin and be able to deal with criticism. I mean, it comes with the territory. My wife saw me at church and I said, "Boy, they tore into you." I'm like, yeah, I kind of signed up for that. I didn't say I'd do it forever either, by the way, but I signed up for it for the time I was doing it. So you have to there's that. So I think we'll now go, Mr. Cohen, did I answer your question? Okay, good. Let me go back out to Zoom. Who's next? I won't keep you forever, by the way. I'll do 8 more minutes and then I'll stay here for anybody who's left. I'll stay till everybody leaves, but I want to keep the Zoom people for 8 more minutes. Is there any other question from Zoom? You guys are awesome for staying on. So still, almost a couple dozen still on Zoom. So thank you for that. Let me go back out to the room. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
There's so much roll in my head with all this, but one thing I wanted to sort of put out there is we need to define what government's role is.
Yes.
From the bottom to the
top.
And so I get a lot of emails from local representatives, here's our news for the week, and from both sides, and there's a lot of, I'm fighting for this, and I'm fighting for that, and look at all of the legislation that I proposed, and Congress is 2 years, right, on the federal level, and Senate is 4. So the idea of the deliberative aspect of that, we're not supposed to pass laws. And if it's an emergency, if your arm is broken, you go and fix it. But there needs to be time for us to think about, do we need the law, first of all, right? And if we need the law, let's make it the best we can make it. And if you're just campaigning on, I'm going to pass 100 laws for you this session, that's not where we're going to fix it.
Okay, very thoughtful comments. Yeah. Your first name, ma'am?
Nadia.
So Nadia just made some very thoughtful comments that I always enjoy when I hear, and that is that as a people, just more patience, understanding that a republic is variegated, it's multi-layered with a federal, a national, and a local, sometimes multiple local levels. And, the whole intent was to refine and enlarge the views so that maybe there isn't going to be an immediate answer to certain things. And we need to study, take a look at it. We should think through, we should debate and be reasonable. But the point is that if we're all measuring people on re-election based on motion, we could end up making a mistake. I used to distinguish between motion and movement. Motion is this, movement is this. I'm actually moving. And too often what politicians will do is they'll do this and they'll say we're moving. And it's like, you're not actually moving. You got motion going, but there's no. So I only say that to say that, I have to say, and I mean this as a compliment, but you're in a minority. Because you're really being very self-restrained about your expectations, even though you're probably passionate like I am about issues, but you're also managing your expectations and you also want people to not make mistakes. So maybe we should think it through. But at this moment in our country's history, it's not really a majority viewpoint. I wish it was.
Well, and I think I'm a teacher and my high schoolers are going through a government class with me. Right?
Yeah.
And sadly, it's only a half a year.
Yeah.
That's all that's required. And
right.
It blows my mind in itself, but we need to start teaching.
Yes.
Government at an elementary level. And yeah, obviously it's going to take time, but
yeah.
And I read a lot of T.K. Chesterton and we teach Chesterton in our school and there's that whole element of whatever you want to call it, subsidiarity.
Yeah.
And it starts with the smallest.
Yeah.
And I tell my kids all the time, my students, what's the smallest unit?
Yeah.
It's your household.
Yeah.
Whether you're 1, whether you're 3 or 2.
Yeah. That's so true.
And you have a responsibility.
Yes.
If it's to take the trash.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone's depending on you taking the trash out. Because if you don't do it, There'll be trash in the house.
So you are affiliated. So the founders did say, they said, look, they understood that regardless, and they were making a conscious choice to go from a confederation to a nation. With that said, they also believed that the strength of that nation was going to be the virtue of their citizens, the strength of their families and communities, that was the bedrock of what the nation was going to be. Whether, by the way, they had this commercial view like Hamilton, or they had this agrarian view like Jefferson, they agreed on that. You reading Chesterton, I just want to say amen, but golly, that's hard. That's some of the densest stuff. Oh, no, we read it because Mary Jo and I also do like pilgrimages for the Franciscan order, and Chesterton's written in the, we do. Yeah, we do. So we go with a priest too, and sometimes a brother, but Chesterton's in that space too. He's written in the spiritual religious space. And so we read him, but it's hard reading. It's pretty dense, but I'm impressed that you do. So let me just finish on a positive note. I see Dick's going to cut the hook. He's going to take me out. I just want to thank you for coming. For those that came in person today with the weather like this and threatening, thank you for making time. I take real strength from that you care, because you could be anywhere and you came here today. That means you darn care. And the founders certainly, that's the kind of activism. When they talk about engaged, this is part of engaged. Voting, yes, but there's so many other things that need to be engaged. To those on Zoom, thank you so much. I appreciated your engagement here today too. And for those on the Zoom, you can look the book up, you can get it online. If you end up reading it, please send me feedback. I have a website. It's thespiritofphiladelphia.com, thespiritofphiladelphia.com, and it's got a contact me where you can actually send me a note, either your question or your comments on any of this today or the book. And, for those who are here that came in just as we were starting or just afterwards, my wife is here representing independent books. This one's Kinrook Independent Bookstore. And so she's got copies for sale, and I would certainly sign them. Thank you so much, everybody. Let's keep faith in our country. You're off.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you all for
irony-
coming on Zoom.
Just 1 second. The irony is I was just getting up to make sure